The courtroom was silent, thick with anticipation. The air felt heavy, as if the entire room had collectively held its breath. All eyes were fixed on Emma Parker, a 13-year-old girl standing in the center of the room. Her hands clenched together as she fought to steady herself. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. Across from her, Rachel Parker, her mother, sat rigid in her chair, her face pale and unreadable. The judge, his sharp gaze unwavering, watched them closely. The entire courtroom, lawyers, jurors, onlookers, was frozen, waiting for the next words to leave Emma's lips. Emma swallowed hard. She had never been one to seek attention, always preferring to blend into the background. But today, there was no hiding. Today, she had to speak. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin and stared directly at her mother. "You knew," she said, her voice trembling but firm. A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom like ripples in a pond. People exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. Rachel's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the arms of her chair. Her eyes darted to the judge, then back to Emma, as if searching for a way out. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. His tone was calm but commanding. "Miss Parker, the court requires an explanation. What exactly do you mean?" Emma exhaled slowly. Her body trembled, but she refused to back down. This was it. The moment the truth would finally come out. The room was deathly still. Rachel Parker sat frozen, her face drained of color, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. The weight of her daughter's words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the courtroom. Emma Parker refused to look away. Her entire body was shaking, but she forced herself to hold her mother's gaze. She had come too far to stop now. "You knew," Emma repeated, louder this time, her voice carrying through the courtroom. Rachel's lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked rapidly, as though trying to process the accusation, trying to will it away. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice firm, "if you are making a claim against your mother, I need you to clarify." Emma inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Her entire life had been built on a lie, and she had spent too long pretending not to notice the cracks. Not anymore. "She knew the truth about my father. About what really happened to him." A collective gasp spread through the room. Several members of the jury exchanged stunned glances. Rachel's entire body stiffened. "That's not true," Rachel whispered, shaking her head. "Emma, I don't know what you're talking about." Emma stepped forward, her voice sharper now. "Stop lying. Stop pretending. I found the letters, the bank records, the photos. I know everything. Mom." Rachel flinched as though she had been struck. Her breathing grew erratic, her fingers twitching against the table. "Emma, please," Rachel whispered. But her voice wavered. Emma clenched her fists. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. "Are you finally going to tell the truth?" Emma demanded, her voice cutting through the silence. Or are you going to keep lying until there's nothing left? Rachel's mouth opened. But instead of words, a sharp, strangled breath escaped. Her hands flew to her chest, her face twisting in an expression of sheer agony. For a second, she swayed unsteadily, her eyes wild with panic. Then, without warning, her body gave out beneath her, and she collapsed. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom as people scrambled from their seats. A guard rushed forward, catching Rachel before she hit the ground. "Someone call for a medic," a voice shouted. Emma stood frozen, her heart pounding in her ears. She had wanted the truth. She had fought for it. But now, as she stared at her mother's limp body on the floor, she wondered, had she just gone too far? The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. But the panic had already taken hold. Court officers rushed to Rachel Parker's side, trying to revive her as a medic was called in. Emma stood motionless, her breathing shallow. She had wanted the truth to come out, but not like this. Had she pushed too hard? Had she just destroyed her own mother? A firm hand landed on her shoulder. "Miss Parker, we need to move," a bailiff said. Emma barely registered his words. Everything felt like a blur as she was guided out of the courtroom, away from the shocked faces and frantic whispers. She didn't even remember walking out the door. Outside the courtroom, she sank into a chair, her hands trembling in her lap. The reality of what had just happened was suffocating. Did I do the right thing? Her mother had lied to her for years, she knew that. But seeing her collapse, so fragile and broken, had cracked something inside of Emma. Something she didn't know if she could fix. The cold, sterile walls of the courthouse seemed to close in around her. She buried her face in her hands, willing herself to breathe. Then, footsteps. A presence beside her. A heavy hand landed on her shoulder. "Emma, we need to talk," a deep voice said. She jerked her head up, startled, her breath still uneven from the overwhelming chaos. Detective Harris stood in front of her, his gaze dark and unreadable. "There's more," he said, his voice steady but urgent. Emma swallowed hard, her heart still racing. More? What could possibly be worse than what had already happened? Before she could ask, the detective gestured toward a side hallway. "Come with me," he said. Emma hesitated for only a moment before pushing herself up and following him. She had just exposed one secret. But something told her there were even darker truths still waiting to be uncovered. The interrogation room was dimly lit, the walls bare and unwelcoming. A single flickering light overhead cast long shadows across the cold metal table where Emma Parker sat. The tension was suffocating. Across from her, Detective Harris leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Beside him, another officer, Sergeant Miller, slid a large, worn envelope across the table. It landed with a soft thud in front of Emma. "We found something during the investigation," Miller said, his voice low and serious. Emma stared at the envelope. Her hands were clammy, her heart hammering in her chest. Whatever was inside. She could feel it was going to change everything. For a moment. She hesitated. Did she really want to see what was inside? Could she handle it? Go ahead. Detective Harris urged. Swallowing hard. Emma reached out with trembling fingers and pulled open the envelope. A stack of photographs slid onto the table. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked up the first one. It was her mother. Rachel Parker stood in the shadows of an alleyway. Her face partially obscured by the hood of a coat. She wasn't alone. Several masked figures surrounded her. Their faces hidden behind black coverings. Bundles of cash were exchanged. Envelopes full of documents were passed between hands. Emma's stomach twisted. This wasn't just some small secret, this was something much bigger. She flipped to the next photo. A different location. But the same scene. Her mother. The masked figures. The money. Each photo made her pulse quicken. This wasn't some one-time mistake. This was an operation. This can't be real. Emma whispered. Shaking her head. We triple-checked. Sergeant Miller said. Your mother wasn't just involved. Emma. She was one of the key players. Emma's mind reeled. Her mother, the woman who had raised her. Who had held her when she cried, had been lying to her entire life. Detective Harris studied her face carefully. This is just the beginning, he warned. We've barely scratched the surface of what she was involved in. Emma clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep looking at the photographs. She had started this journey believing she was uncovering a buried family secret. But now, as she stared at the undeniable proof before her, she realized she wasn't just exposing a lie. She was uncovering a crime. The weight of the photographs still sat heavily in Emma Parker's hands. But before she could fully process them, Detective Harris slid another folder onto the table. This goes deeper than just your mother, he said. His tone sharp and measured. Emma swallowed. Her fingers tightening around the edges of the photos. What do you mean? Detective Harris exchanged a glance with Sergeant Miller before exhaling. We traced a phone number from one of the burner phones used in the operation. Emma held her breath. Harris hesitated for just a second before saying the words that would shatter her world even more. The number belongs to your uncle, Matthew Parker. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Emma's breath hitched. Her vision swimming as she tried to process the impossible. Uncle Matthew? The quiet man who had always stood on the sidelines. Watching. Barely speaking. Matthew had always been distant. Quiet. A shadow in the background of their family gatherings. He had never seemed like someone important. Never dangerous. That doesn't make sense. Emma whispered. He barely even speaks to us. Why would he be involved in something like this? Her father. David Parker. Who had been silent until now. Stiffened. His face was pale. His fingers digging into the table. This can't be true. David muttered. His voice thick with disbelief. Matthew, he trailed off. Unable to finish the sentence. Detective Harris frowned. We started looking into him after your mother's collapse. At first. There was nothing unusual. He keeps a low profile. No criminal record. No large transactions. But then we found offshore accounts. Millions of dollars. All linked to illegal dealings. Emma felt sick. Your uncle isn't just involved, Emma. Harris continued grimly. He's the one pulling the strings. The room spun. Emma gripped the edge of the chair, trying to steady herself. Everything she thought she knew about her family was unraveling. Her mother wasn't just lying, she was working for Matthew. Emma's voice wavered. So, all of this, the meetings, the secret money, the crime, it was him? Harris nodded. We believe he's been running this operation for years. Your mother might have started off as an unwilling participant. But at some point, she got in too deep. David slammed a fist onto the table. His jaw clenched in fury. Where is he now? Harris's eyes darkened. We don't know yet. But we're working on it. David shot to his feet. Then what are we waiting for? Harris met his gaze. We need to bring him in. Now. Emma barely heard anything else. Her uncle, the quiet, unassuming man who had always been on the edges of her life, was the mastermind behind everything. And now, they had to stop him. The night was thick with tension as Emma Parker sat in the back of the unmarked police car. The city lights blurred past her window. But she wasn't paying attention. Her hands trembled in her lap. Her breath shallow. This was it. The truth had led them here, to a crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of town, where her uncle Matthew Parker was hiding. Her father, David Parker, sat beside her. His jaw clenched. His face was unreadable. But Emma could sense the storm brewing inside him. Are you ready for this? Detective Harris asked from the front seat, his voice low. Emma swallowed hard. No, she admitted. But it didn't matter. The truth wouldn't wait. And neither could they. The car came to a stop. And the officers filed out swiftly, their weapons drawn. Emma's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she followed behind her father. They moved through the abandoned warehouse cautiously, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the steel beams. The air smelled of dust and oil. Then they saw him. Matthew Parker stood in the center of the warehouse, waiting for them. He was calm, too calm. Dressed in a dark suit. He barely looked like a man on the run. Instead, he looked like a man who had been expecting them. You really think you've won? Matthew's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smirk. His hands remained in his pockets, as if he was still in control. As if none of this truly mattered to him. David stepped forward, his voice full of fury. It's over. Matthew. You're done. But Matthew only chuckled, shaking his head. You don't even know what you've stepped into. Do you? His cold gaze flickered toward Emma. And you, my own niece. I expected more from you. Emma's fists clenched. This man wasn't her family. Not anymore. Before she could speak, chaos erupted. A sudden movement, then gunfire. Everything happened at once. Shots rang out in the night. The officers yelled. diving for cover. Emma's body was shoved to the ground as her father shielded her. "Dad!" Emma gasped. But David didn't respond. More gunfire. More shouts. The sound of boots against concrete. Then silence. Emma barely registered the officers swarming in, wrestling Matthew Parker to the ground. He was arrested. The mastermind was caught. But Emma couldn't focus on that. Because her father wasn't moving. She rolled onto her side and saw him lying next to her. A dark stain spreading across his chest. "No. No, no, no." Emma crawled to him, her hands shaking as she pressed against the wound. "Dad. Stay with me. Please." David's eyes fluttered open. His breathing labored. "Emma," his voice was weak. But he still tried to smile. Tears blurred Emma's vision. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. His hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "You're strong. Emma, you'll be okay." His fingers loosened. His chest rose once more, then stilled. Emma let out a broken sob. The officers were still moving around her, securing Matthew, calling for medics. But none of it mattered. Her father was gone. The cost of the truth had been too high. The world around Emma Parker faded into nothing. The sounds of police radios, shuffling boots, and urgent voices all blurred into a distant hum. The only thing that mattered was the man lying in front of her. Her father, David Parker, was bleeding out. His breaths coming in short, uneven gasps. His skin had grown pale, his eyes flickering as he fought to stay conscious. Emma clutched his hand, her fingers trembling as she pressed down on his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Dad. Hold on," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto his shirt, mixing with the blood. His lips curled into a weak smile. "Emma, you did it," he whispered. She shook her head frantically. "No. I didn't. I didn't want this. You can't leave me." David's fingers weakly squeezed hers. His eyes, though full of pain, held something else too pride. "You're strong, Emma," he murmured, his breath faltering, his voice no more than a whisper. "You'll be okay." Emma sobbed, her vision blurring from the flood of tears. "No, please. Just hold on. The medics are coming. Okay? Just keep talking to me." But his grip on her hand slackened, his fingers slipping through hers like sand. His chest rose in one final, shaky breath, then fell still. Emma froze. For a moment, she refused to believe it. She waited for his chest to rise again. For him to blink. For him to squeeze her hand one more time. But nothing happened. A sob tore through her, her entire body shaking. She collapsed against him, gripping his shirt as if holding him tighter would somehow bring him back. "Dad. Please," she whimpered. The officers moved around her, but no one dared to pull her away. Because in that moment, Emma Parker had lost everything. The father who had always protected her. The family she thought she knew. The life she had before this moment. And now, she was alone. The rain fell in steady drops, soaking the fresh earth as people gathered around the small, gray tombstone. The name David Parker was etched into the stone. A date marking the end of his life. Emma Parker stood motionless, gripping a black umbrella. Her face pale and emotionless. She had no more tears left to cry. Around her, mourners whispered condolences. But she barely heard them. Nothing anyone said could fix this. The media had been relentless, covering the case like it was just another scandal. Headlines screamed about corruption, crime rings, and betrayals. But Emma didn't care. Her uncle, Matthew Parker, had been sentenced. Life in prison. But it didn't bring her father back. It didn't erase what had happened. She had exposed the truth. But at what cost? Emma clenched her fists, staring at the gravestone. 4 weeks. She had felt lost, drowning in grief. But as she looked at her father's name, she remembered his last words, "You're strong, Emma. You'll be okay." And for the first time since that night, she believed him. The truth had destroyed everything. It had torn her family apart, stolen her innocence, and left scars she would carry forever. But in the end, it had also set her free. Emma turned away from the grave, her heart still aching, but steady. The past had broken her, but it had not destroyed her. She couldn't change what happened, but she could decide what happened next.